Charged in a shooting, a South Bronx minor spent a year in the bowels of Rikers Island jail. Oddly, the prosecutor gave him a chance to walk free if he admitted guilt. He said no. But is he innocent? Well, a former NYPD police officer turned private eye has a story of his own, saying the facts of the case just don't add up, and the arresting officer has a menacing reputation among residents and children. So who's telling the truth? And are you and your loved ones at risk? Before we get into those details, let's listen to a clip from Conviction, a new podcast from Gimlet Media that takes a deep dive into the story.
In the South Bronx, there are people fighting every day.
I know my son was innocent, and I couldn't prove it. I didn't know how to.
Fighting a police force that wants to lock them up, the people of the South Bronx are at a big disadvantage. But they do have one secret weapon.
I'm Private Investigator Manuel Gomez.
What do you do?
Now I see myself as a punisher for the wicked.
My name's Saki Knafo, and I'm the host of Conviction, a new podcast from Gimlet Media. Our first season follows Private Eye Manuel Gomez as he hunts for information.
So I kept looking.
From one corner of the city,
from park to schoolyard to basketball courts,
to another.
The social corners where people would gather near bodega where the music was.
Trying to solve the biggest case of his life.
And then I had a realization that this is huge. This is way bigger than what I thought it was. I knew it was big when I got involved, but I didn't realize it was going to be a nightmare, a gargantuan nightmare that is affecting an entire community, an entire police precinct.
Along the way, he runs into some trouble. Turns out, when you're going head-to-head with people in power, you have to watch your back.
It's like walking a tightrope. You can't slip, because if you slip, all hell breaks loose.
Joining us now is Saki Knafo, host of Conviction. Saki, welcome to Metro Focus.
Thanks for having me.
So first, tell us, how was it that you came about creating this series and getting into this story?
I was covering criminal justice, and I'd been writing about the NYPD, specifically about officers in the NYPD who were blowing the whistle against what they felt to be discriminatory practices. And through them, I met a former NYPD officer named Manuel Gomez, who had become a private eye. And as a private eye, he was taking a stand against the police department, looking for cases of people who claimed to have been arrested for crimes they did not commit. And he was finding evidence that was helping get those cases overturned.
So with this case of this young man, Pedro, tell us, without giving, of course, too much away, but tell us, what was it that you were able to unearth with this piece, with this series?
Well, I followed Manny over the course of his investigation. The investigation took more than a year, and Pedro was in jail in Rikers that whole time.
The whole time.
Yeah. So I followed Manny, and he challenges the credibility of officers and prosecutors and the people who were involved in these cases. He goes on the media and goes after their reputations, and he speaks with people in the neighborhood who have stories about them that challenge their credibility. So. I followed him while he was doing all this, and I also eventually began speaking to the people that Manny was going after, including an officer at the center of the story.
So with the young man at the heart of the story, Pedro, so many stories that we hear about, particularly young people who, when they're taken to Rikers, are coerced into confessions sometimes.
Right.
And I'm wondering if you were able to speak to members of his family to sort of get a sense as to how he was able to stand his ground and insist that he was not going to admit to something that he says he did not do. Right.
Well, I think part of that is him. I think he has a very strong will. That's something that his mother told me. I think he probably gets it from her. But also part of it was the private investigator who they hired. So usually what happens, a young person is sent to Rikers and they immediately come under intense pressure to take a plea deal. They're held in jail for months or sometimes years while waiting for a trial. And even though they haven't been convicted of anything, they are kept there in terrible conditions and offered plea deals. And usually they're not allowed to see the evidence against them. They can barely see any of the evidence that the prosecution may have against them. So it's very difficult for them or their defense attorneys, who are usually public defenders, to prepare a case, to prepare defense that would give them the confidence to go to trial. Mm-hmm. Manny kind of changes the equation. When they hired Manny, he immediately went out into the streets and he, over a short period of time, he found a number of people who said they'd witnessed the shooting and that Pedro didn't do it. He then found the victim of the shooting, who also told a story that raised a lot of questions about the legitimacy of the case against Pedro. So by doing that, by finding these witnesses, mm-hmm. and by going on TV and kind of publicly attacking the credibility of the cops and prosecutors involved in the case, he was able, I think, to give Pedro the confidence to say, no, I won't take the deal, I'll hold out until the case is dismissed.
Well, let me ask, what happens now? Because we've seen some instances where there's been media attention on a case, perhaps a private investigator will look deeper into something and find a different narrative than what was presented, at least in court. But the person remains in jail. Do we know what happens with all of this information that's been unearthed when it comes to Pedro? We
do. It had a very big impact on Pedro's life and on his future. So I'll tell you that. But another important thing to know about the private investigator, Manny Gomez, is that his methods are controversial and he's not afraid to go to extremes. And in doing that, he's rubbed a lot of people the wrong way, and a lot of people have raised questions about his own credibility. So he pushes the envelope.
I want to thank you so much for bringing us this story, bringing us this podcast. And I want to tell our viewers, to learn more about the story and where you can listen to the rest of Conviction, visit us at metrofocus.org.